name or which person should the S be named after. And the decision was, oh, we'll just use the letter S, honor both grandfathers, and that'll be it. So it is not Harry S. period Truman. It is simply Harry S. Truman. All right, now if there was ever a person who someone would say would never be president of the United States, it would be Harry S. Truman. Truman was certainly not seeking the presidency. He's one of the few presidents who never sought the job. Another one would be Gerald Ford, of course. These people ended up in the presidency, certainly somewhat by accident, all right, and certainly didn't have the ambition to be president. They didn't think of themselves as worthy enough. And when Truman became president suddenly, he certainly felt very modest. He certainly felt very much as a person who he hoped could fill the shoes of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and very few people believed that when he became president. The joke was that on the evening that he became president, that many people crossed themselves praying for him, and this included people who were not Christian. So, I mean, that shows you how much people did not believe that indeed he could do the job. But did he fill the job? Oh, wow, did he fill the job. Even though we have to admit that in his presidency he was constantly under attack, viciously attacked. There became a saying, to err, E-R-R, is Truman. To err is Truman. He was ridiculed by liberals in the Democratic Party. He was blasted by the opposition Republicans. Everybody thought he couldn't win a full term in 1948, except for himself. Even his wife didn't think so, and actually was happy that he wouldn't win, because she wanted to go home. And she wasn't too happy when he won in 1948, and so she went home anyway, hardly stayed in the White House, and indeed on the weekend of the Korean War's beginning, he's in Kansas City in Independence with his wife, goes back and forth because Bess does not want to spend time in the White House. She is not a modern first lady. She would never make it in the world of the media today. She just didn't like being in public, and she was very relieved when he finally retired in 1953 because she had never really had wanted to be first lady. And there's even a story about her as First Lady early on, which explains a lot why she is indeed unhappy in that position. First Ladies get all kinds of ceremonial duties, and one of them was to commission a ship to break a champagne bottle against the bow of the ship. And, you know, she has the bottle, and she whacks at the ship's bow. It doesn't break. It's actually a video of this on YouTube, all right? And she tries again. Whack. Nothing. Third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. You have to be laughing by that time. She is totally frustrated. The admiral behind her gets behind her to help her, and finally she breaks the bottle. And after that, she's humiliated, and she doesn't want to be in public anymore. And I can't blame her in a way. Now, I have to say, Truman always defended his wife. He always said she was, quote, the boss. And she was, really. I want to point out that he knew her from the time he was 6 and she was 5. They were neighbors. And they knew each other for 29 years before they finally married. And when he first proposed to her a few years before they got married, she said no. All right, now beyond that, her mother did not like Harry. Never liked him. Didn't even like him when they got married. Always had negative things to say about Harry. The typical mother-in-law image, you know, that we always like to joke about. All right, now he became president. Now it's true he became president by accident. He didn't get elected originally. But when he becomes president, his mother-in-law is still alive, and she's asked by someone, how do you feel about your son-in-law now? And she says, She still was not impressed with him, even when he's president. He could not win her support. All right, now he's very loyal to their daughter, Margaret, who, of course, becomes famous later as a novelist. Murder mysteries around government buildings, like 20 or 30 of these, I think at least 20 novels. Murder at the White House, murder at the Supreme Court, murder at the Kennedy Center, etc. All kinds. And she was quite a prolific author. And the thing is that she also tried herself at concert singing and wasn't really very good. And there was a performance at, I think it was Carnegie Hall, I think it was in New York City, and she was not good. She was off tune. And the Washington Post had a critic there who really panned her and said, oh, she's terrible. She should stick to something else. And Harry gets furious. He writes a note on White House stationery, sends it off to this Washington Post critic who he doesn't know, and it becomes a big controversy because it's foul in nature. And it basically says, by saying exactly what was said, that if I ever meet you, I'm going to emasculate you for what you said about my daughter. So he is loyal to his daughter. He's loyal to his wife. There were love letters between Bess and Harry and all that. The man has a good marriage. And certainly he is one president that we say never cheated on his wife. I think she would have killed him if he had. In any case, but the point is that he was not the type to do it. He just wasn't. Some people even thought he never was with another woman in his life except Bess. This was his life, even though he married at age 35, all right? So they were married 53 years, and she outlived him by a decade and became the longest-lived First Lady, dying at age 97. Truman himself died at age 88 and a half, all right? And he died on the same day of the year that the other president who didn't ever think of being president died, Gerald Ford and Harry Truman share that distinction, both dying the day after Christmas. Of course, in the case of Truman, it's 1972. In the case of Gerald Ford, it's 2006. But immediately when we learned about his death, I said, oh my God, Truman and Ford neither planned to be president, and they died on the same day of the year. This is the kind of nutty stuff that I think about when I'm driving up to Jupiter. Crazy things, but just little trivia things that I think about. But it is true, they're the only two. In fact, I think except for the presidents who died on July 4th, and that's three of them, of course, Adams, Jefferson, and Monroe, I don't think any other two presidents have died on the same day of the year, other than the ones I've mentioned. So that's a trivia thing, and I am a trivia buff. All right, now, anyway, Truman is a very ordinary man. He grows up in Independence, Missouri, outside of Kansas City, Missouri. He graduates high school. He does not go to college. He goes to a business school for a while, but he does not attend college. He's the only president of the 20th century never to have attended college or graduated college, but he's well-read, extremely well-read. He is very knowledgeable, particularly on biography and history. He is very informed. It shows again, which is always true, it's nice to have an education. It's important now. But honestly, you can educate yourself. You don't have to be in a classroom all the time or have a degree to be educated. I mean, here's a man who didn't have a college degree, but he became a great leader. And then you look and you think about modern politicians, all who have gone to college and graduated. And some of them you say, really? And I won't mention names, so I don't antagonize anybody. But I have quite a list I could pick up. That I could start with, present and recent past, that you say, including at least one person who was vice president of the United States in the past, including one who could have been vice president of the United States recently, so you can sort of get hints of who I'm thinking of. But I'm not going to go further than that, and it's not just one party. Let's face it, there are some morons in both parties. Doesn't matter. And the fact is that it doesn't mean having a college degree makes you brilliant. Far from it. Truman was quite a guy, and he also, he did not go to college, as I've said, but he worked at various jobs, and he worked as a bank teller, for instance, at one point. He also joined the National Guard, and ended up when World War I came on, he went over to France and served in the war in France. And did his duty. Even though he had bad eyesight, he wouldn't ordinarily have been able to go over, but he memorized the eye chart, so he cheated so that he could go over. That's how patriotic he was. And he did his service. He came back looking for a job after the First World War and decides to open up a men's haberdashery, actually a haberdashery business is what it is, with Eddie Jacobson, a Jewish friend, who, by the way, is his good friend, but is not admitted into the house by Bess. We have to say Bess is anti-Semitic, and he allows her to be. So he's friends with Eddie Jacobson, but she never allows him in the house. That's a negative thing about Bess. She's not the nicest person all the time toward people. But Eddie Jacobson is not only involved in the haberdashery business, which, by the way, goes bankrupt, but also he's going to be one of the people pushing Truman to recognize the new nation of Israel in 1948, at a time when General not general then, but former general and now Secretary of State George C. Marshall is advising him, don't recognize Israel, you'll upset the Arabs and the oil issue will become a problem. And Secretary of Defense James Forrestal also said, not a good idea, not so much about not recognizing, but that it would cause troubles with the Arabs. And Truman making the clear statement that, I don't care what it does, it's the right thing to do. And of course, Eddie Jacobson and a few others helping to work on him and convince him of it. And his recognition of Israel within 11 minutes of the declaration of Israel as a new nation and acceptance by the United Nations on May 14th, 1948. All right, now, so anyway, the men's, the haberdashery business, I should say, fails. He's bankrupt. He needs a job, so you're bankrupt. You're 38 years old. You have a young daughter, Margaret, and you need a job. So if you need a job and you've gone bankrupt and you're in trouble, what do? You get into politics. What does that tell us? All right? He gets involved in the Democratic Party political machine that runs Kansas City. It is a political machine. There are political machines all over the country, unfortunately, but they make things work for the citizens while being corrupt. He's not personally corrupt, but he is part of the Kansas City machine run by Thomas Pendergast, who in later years will go to federal prison on corruption charges. And of course, people say, oh, he's connected to Pendergast. Yeah, but really in a distant way. But yeah, he does. It's unfortunate, but it really doesn't make him corrupt. There is no evidence of him, Truman, being corrupt. All right, now, he ends up working as a county administrator in Jackson County, and makes a pretty good salary, and he does that for about a decade, and he helps develop the public works of the area, of Jackson County, the Kansas City area. All right, and then in 1934, the thought is that he is being pushed by some, because he's done a good job as a county administrator, to go to national office as a U.S. senator. And really, there are other Democrats who want the nomination, and the thought is the Republicans probably will win the seat. And it ends up, Truman is given the nomination with the assumption he's going to lose the election to the Republican. He's not going to win. He's always underrated. That's the point. He's always underestimated. But he runs a good race, and he becomes a United States Senator at age 50, because he was born in 1884. All right, so he's age 50. He moves to D.C. He becomes a senator who's noticed but is not controversial, which is actually good. He's sort of like a moderate Democrat, not really liberal, but not really conservative, right down the middle, a centrist, which is probably, in most respects, the best place to be if you have an idea of a future. Although his future is, he just wants to get reelected in 1940. And after a rough race, it's not going to be easy, he wins a second term, and now he starts to get noticed because World War II comes on, and he becomes the head of a committee investigating waste, fraud, and abuse in the defense industries, something worthy of doing any time, including now. My gosh. So it's known as the Truman Committee. So he becomes a bit controversial, but also he's saving the government money. He comes across as someone getting rid of corruption and scandal and fraud. And it looks particularly good after Pendergast is in prison that this guy, Truman, is doing what he's doing to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse in the Defense Department, actually what's called the War Department at the time. All right, now, so what we have is Truman is noticed, but he's still not really controversial. He's just noticed as competent and decent. He's a loyal supporter of FDR and the New Deal. He's met him a few times, but doesn't know him very well. And Roosevelt is now in his third term as President of the United States, having broken the two-term tradition. And his vice president is not the same one as the first two terms. The first two terms, it is John Nance Garner, who had been the Speaker of the House from the state of Texas, who refused to run with him when he ran for a third term. Garner wanted to be the president and was furious that FDR was breaking the two-term tradition, so he refused to run with him. He picked now, for the third term, Roosevelt, Secretary of Agriculture, Henry A. Wallace, who had been a Republican and a progressive Republican, but had become a Democrat, was very good on the issue of agriculture, now was picked to be a third-term vice president, and Roosevelt let him be free to speak his own mind, and he did, Wallace, and he made enemies as he spoke up. We never had really had a vice president who ever spoke up openly before, and that is one thing Wallace stands out for. We say it's the beginning of the evolution of the vice presidency, really, it is. Because the vice president's not just standby equipment, he's his own man to some extent, not completely his own man, but able to speak out on his own. But the trouble is, he makes enemies. Number one, he talks about the possibility of cooperation with our ally during the war, the Soviet Union, and there was a lot of debate about, can we really trust the Soviet Union? And to many people, he seems a little bit too trusting of the Soviet Union, although I have to point out, FDR's third-term opponent, Wendell Willkie, also was saying that we need to try to work and have cooperation before he himself passed away in 1944. Both of them were saying similar things, and it was a debate in America. We have the Russians as our allies now against Germany and eventually against Japan, but can we work with them, trust them, etc.? And the thing is, Wallace came across to many as a little too soft, a little too leftist, maybe a danger. Others, of course, thought he was fine. There was a debate about it. Now, that's one issue, and that's a problem. But the bigger issue is Wallace has courage and guts. He's going to speak up on civil rights and the South and the need to stop lynchings in the South and to promote civil rights and stop segregation of the races. Boy, is he ahead of himself as far as how the South feels and how much of the nation feels. And he antagonizes Southern Democrats who see him as a danger. And, you know, when Roosevelt runs for a fourth term and he doesn't look good and he shouldn't have run, I think a lot of people are whispering he's not going to make it through 4 more years, although he's nominated, that therefore we can't have this guy Wallace who wants to integrate and wants to stop lynchings and all this and maybe is soft on the Soviet Union. We can't afford to have this guy a heartbeat away. All right, now, of course, Roosevelt could have died in that third term and Wallace would have been president. But he doesn't, but he's certainly declining in his health and should not have run. But he is running to finish the job of World War II. And what we're going to have, therefore, is the battle at the Democratic Convention over who is going to be his running mate. Wallace, of course, hopes he will be, but Roosevelt's told by Southerners, we will not back your fourth-term nomination if you pick Wallace, pick someone else. All right, so there's a few choices that are mentioned. One of them is James F. Burns, senator from South Carolina. He's passed by. Another one is, get this, Justice William O. Douglas of the Supreme Court. He's passed by. Interesting to think about Douglas, because realize, whoever's being picked is going to be the next president. Imagine Douglas. Now, people might have said, oh, he's a fairly liberal Supreme Court justice, right? Yeah, he's still new on the court. He's only been on 5 years, but nobody knew the future of Douglas. Douglas would stay on the court longer than anybody until 1975. 36 years on the court, all-time record. Extremely liberal, which is, whether you like it or not, that's interesting. But get this, he became highly controversial, Douglas, because he was married 4 times. He divorced, married a younger woman, divorced, married a much younger woman, divorced, and married a much, much, much younger woman. Unbelievable. Imagine if a president had done that. Maybe he wouldn't have been able to, or wouldn't have. Now, what's interesting about all this is, toward the end of his life, he has his 4th wife, who's like 25 when he's 70, and we have Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, Senator Thurmond, who condemns this immorality and lack of ethics, blah, 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 and calls for the impeachment of Douglas in 1970. And in one moment that is a sad moment for Gerald Ford, he supports it. One of the few things I can find for with Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford also moves to impeach Douglas. Interesting, because later Ford is president when Douglas retires, and Ford applauds him and talks all wonderful things about him. And I'm thinking, you're just such a phony. You wanted to impeach him 5 years ago. Now you're saying, well, because he's retiring, so you say nice things about people who retire or are dead, right? That's usually the way it is, but it is ironic that Ford was pushing it. It didn't happen, but what's interesting is a year later, Thurmond thought about it, I guess, and said, wow, a much younger woman. And he ended up marrying a woman in her 20s. So he ended up being a hypocrite. He ended up with a young wife and many children. Amazing. It's just, the whole story is amazing. But imagine if Douglas had been picked, or Burns. But instead, the thought is, well, Truman is safe, has that defense record, the Truman Committee. He's not controversial. He hasn't spoken up on civil rights, and he hadn't. So therefore, he's the right person for the times. So therefore, Truman is selected. Wallace is basically told, you're going to finish the term, of course, but you're out. He wasn't too happy. but he couldn't do anything about it. So Truman runs with Roosevelt. Roosevelt does not campaign much. Truman does more. Roosevelt looks terrible. I wonder if Truman thought, we don't know, that FDR was dying. But you really can't say that. I mean, he might have thought it, but he never expressed it. I don't think he really thought he would be president, but certainly he might have been. Might have been. All right, well, they win a fourth term. January 20th, 1945, Wallace leaves the vice presidency. Truman becomes vice president. And, of course, FDR's off to Yalta, last summit that he's going to have with Stalin and Churchill. And he doesn't look good compared to the Tehran conference of November, December 43. He aged horribly in the year 44. But he's there. He comes back. He gives a speech to Congress in his wheelchair, pointing out he's sitting in his wheelchair. He had never talked about his handicap publicly otherwise, and goes off to Warm Springs, Georgia, to recuperate from the long, arduous trip. And he's in poor health. He has congestive heart failure, after all. And, of course, he will die on April 12th, 1945, after 12 years and 39 days in office, but 82 days into that term, because the term of office had changed by the 20th Amendment as of 1937 from March 4th to January 20th. So it's 39 days beyond March 4th, but 82 days beyond the fourth inauguration. All right, and Truman had only had one or two meetings briefly with FDR before Yalta and after, but very brief. He had not been told about the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. He didn't know anything, really. This was terrible. I think Roosevelt felt nobody needs to know. I'm the president. I'm never going to die. I don't know. He must have had this idea, that that's the way it is. It's an ego thing. All right, but suddenly, on the afternoon of April 12, 1945, news comes to D.C. that FDR, after 12 years and 39 days, is dead. And Eleanor Roosevelt is in the White House. She calls the Senate, where Truman is presiding, obviously as vice president presiding, and asks him to come over. And he comes over to the White House. He is not aware yet of FDR's death. And she informs him that FDR has died in Warm Springs, Georgia. You are now president of the United States. Is there anything I can do to help you out? My God, what a thing. And as he then said when he was sworn in, I feel as if the sun, the moon, and the planets have fallen upon me. Wish me luck. And again, that night, Jews were crossing themselves. Muslims were crossing themselves, along with Christians. And even atheists were. All right, now, I mean, like, this guy, who the hell is he that he could be president? Yeah, he's a pretty good senator, but nobody saw him as a president. He wore glasses. He wasn't exactly great looking. He wasn't a great orator. He was a person who seemed very modest and unassuming and a nice person, but this guy is coming in, and by the way, people were thinking, I'm sure I was already born just barely, just a few months old, but I'm sure if I'd been older, I would have said, why in the world, Franklin Roosevelt, you have to die just now? The war isn't over in Europe yet, and the war against Japan is not over. Couldn't you at least waited like Lincoln did to die after the war? As if you can control that. So he comes in with less than a month till the war in Europe ends, as it turns out. It ends on his birthday, May 8th, which is a nice 61st birthday gift, certainly. But the point is that that's an unbelievable month, because that month we're going to have the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, of the Molotov cocktails, you've heard about, come to the White House to sort of like pay a cordial call upon the new president, sort of like, although the president in office had died, congratulate him on becoming president. And already, the U.S. had become aware that the Yalta agreements were not being obeyed, and in fact, FDR had planned a speech over the radio for April 13th to condemn the Soviets for breaking the agreements of 2 months earlier, but he died on April 12th, but Truman was well aware. So Truman basically read Molotov the Riot Act and used some sort of like crude language, which he could be known for. And Molotov was so-called insulted the way Truman treated him. And the critics of Truman on the left, the new left critics of the 1960s and after, would say, this is the beginning of the Cold War, when Truman is disrespectful to Molotov. And I say, rolling my eyes, give me a break. I do not believe that's the case. Maybe it was a little too blunt. Maybe it was not an ideal way to speak. But Truman was a guy who spoke his mind, and he stands out already, even in his first days, as a gutsy guy. He's absolutely gutsy. He's also, as we're going to see, decisive. He's also courageous. Those are the words that go well with him. Decisive, gutsy, courageous. And he becomes a model over time for presidents of both parties, even though he would be bitterly attacked while he was in office. But really, he would definitely be, those characteristics without any doubt. Courageous, gutsy, and decisive. All right, but that's one event. Now, the UN has its first meeting in San Francisco June this month, and we fully back the United Nations formation. This is also the month that Benito Mussolini is killed by partisans in Italy and hanged from his heels, and his body cut into little pieces for souvenirs. And the next day, Adolf Hitler commits suicide in his bunker, April 30th, unless you believe the Weekly World News, which no longer exists, that said he lived to 103 in Argentina. And they showed a picture of him in a casket at 103, looking very old. And, of course, the Weekly World News no longer exists. Does that tell you something? All right, now, the point is, though, Hitler's gone, Mussolini's gone, the war is going on in Europe. The fact is, on May 8th, the war is over officially. And the fact is, that doesn't mean that just because the war is over, everything's fine. There's tremendous destruction all over Europe. There's, of course, the victims of the Holocaust, the concentration camps being opened, and all that to deal with refugees and the issue of all the dead bodies and everything else. Horrible situation. But this is all going on. But what's also going on is fear of the Soviets that they're expanding and that they're going to be a continual problem, and fighting the war against Japan. My God, the war against Japan. Looks as if it might go on for another couple of years because Shintoism was emperor worship. And the idea was there's no way that we're going to have this war end unless every man, woman, and child sacrifices himself, herself, for the emperor, unless something changes. So there were already plans to invade the Japanese islands, the main islands. There were already, of course, battles at all the different island chains all the way up to Japan. Marines dying in large numbers, Japanese dying down to the last man, committing ritual suicide. We had already Japanese pilots committing, hara-kiri, not hara-kiri, but I mean having their planes smashed into American ships, committing suicide. Soldiers cutting their chests open rather than surrender. Unbelievable fanaticism. And many people fighting in Europe, now the war is over, were going to be commissioned to go to Asia. And believe me, after 4 years of war, they had made it through. They didn't want to do that. And Truman was told privately, we didn't know yet, now by the Secretary of War, something he had not known. There's a project developed originally or promoted by Albert Einstein and developed during the war, atomic bomb, splitting of the atom, and he's not a scientist, and there's going to be 3 weapons eventually ready in a short time, and should he use it or not? And we have some scientists who worked on the project say, oh my God, no, do not use it. We had other scientists say, absolutely use it. We had military people saying use it. The thought was it could save lives. It could save a lot of American and British and other Allied lives. And even though people would be killed, it would ultimately save more Japanese lives than fighting a war for another couple of years, in theory. All right, so he had to make a decision. And the scientists who argued against it and others who argued privately against it said, if you do this, it may destroy the Earth. It may destroy the Earth. We may have tidal waves, earthquakes, and it'll be totally destroyed. And others said, no, it wouldn't happen. But how could one know? How could one possibly know? So he had to make a decision. He had to make a decision. Is he going to take a chance? And if he's wrong, and the world is, let's say, mostly destroyed, then the joke, as it would become later, would be, let's say, thousands of years later, or maybe millions of years later, some intelligent life from elsewhere would arrive on Earth and see the destruction of the Earth, and they'd say, what happened here in the past? And they would find some kind of a paper note or tablet that would say, that jerk Truman had to test that bomb, damn it. I mean, it was a big gamble. But he decided to do it. He first tested the weapon in New Mexico, and even that was dangerous, in the deserts of New Mexico in July 1945. How did one know it was going to work out? It was a gamble, but it worked out. And then he threatened Japan. Leaflets were dropped and all that, but of course the people didn't have any say, and no reaction by the Japanese. So on August 6th, 1945, we have the dropping of the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Some people pronounce it Hiroshima. Kills maybe 100,000 or more people, levels the city completely, and we learn about this in 46 with the film that's taken at the time, shocking to people about the total destruction and mass loss of life. asked for a quick surrender. There's disarray in the Japanese government. Unfortunately, they don't react fast enough. I don't know if you could ever be fast enough on something like that. And we don't wait. August 9th at Nagasaki, the second and last one we had three. We had used all three. We had no others. And then we waited, and we assumed Japan would surrender immediately. Not so quickly. And I'm sure there were people in the War Department starting to panic. Oh, my God, they're not going to surrender after 2 bombs that have killed maybe 200,000 people and done mass destruction, and we have no other equivalent bombing to do now. Oh, my gosh. It took to August 14th. It must have been torturous waiting for the emperor to announce they would be surrender, go on the radio, people hearing his voice for the first time, and he would surrender to General Douglas MacArthur on the battleship USS Missouri, appropriately, Missouri, on September 2nd, 1945. All right? And ever since, there's been debate about it. Should we have used the atomic bomb at all? Some people say no. Others say, well, the first one, yes, but the second one was too quick. Others say no, it was perfect timing. Others say it could have been delayed, maybe avoided. That debate goes on. It's still a debate that will continue. I would say certainly the first bomb I could see absolutely making sense. Second one, I probably would have waited a few more days if I was the president, but not long, just a few more days. It might have led to the result of surrender without the second bomb, so maybe we could have delayed it. But the point is, Truman in his memoirs wrote, I have no doubts, I have no second thoughts, I sleep at night. Others would say, how can you sleep at night after what you did? Well, firebombing of Tokyo and firebombing of Dresden and other places in the war was actually, in many cases, killing more people. So war is hell, and the answer was he felt he did what he had to do, and World War II veterans, of course, have always applauded him because they were the ones who would have died or been potentially dying, if they had to go and fight another year or two in Asia. And of course, Shintoism was changed to be no longer emperor worship, and the emperor was allowed to remain on the throne. Emperor Hirohito, who had been on the throne since 1926 and would stay on to 1989, come to the United States under every president, and our presidents would go to see him. And people have always argued he's a war criminal. Others say not quite, but it helped to stabilize Japan. It helped to make it a democracy and a stable economic nation, one of the great economic powers of the world. It's still very stable today under his son Akihito, and it is democratic. I guess we could say Japan is a success story. We wish it could have been that way in Iraq. It didn't happen. Situation is different. We could wish it could be that way in Afghanistan, but it's different. But Japan and Germany also. I mean, I remember when Germany became united in 1990, I was worried. I thought it's great East and West Germany are now united, but somehow the thought that this could be a danger. It's been perfectly fine since. So I've been worried about it, knowing the history of Germany, but Germany is an economic powerhouse and democratic in nature, and it turns out that we did really, with our commitment to the war, really change the course of world history, at least in Europe, and at least in the case of Japan in Asia. And also South Korea today is a democratic nation. All right, now, so in any case, the big debate about all that. But in the midst of all that, the Soviet threat is developing more than ever. And behind the scenes, we're having the evolution of a new foreign policy. And we're going to say, as Walter Lippmann, the famous columnist, called it, the evolution of the, quote, Cold War, meaning we're going to react to Soviet threats and expansion. We're going to make sure, as much as we can, there's no expansion. However, we're not going to be able to push the Soviets back in Eastern Europe, unfortunately. We don't have the means to do it, although some would argue for that. But we're definitely going to make sure that what we do is prevent expansion, and therefore there will be crisis after crisis constantly for the next 44 years, from 1945 to 1989. And each time there's a crisis, including the biggest ones like the Cuban Missile Crisis, after all the tension and all of the stress, what is the end result? I have to say honestly, the Soviets blinked. They backed off. They gave us hell, and they backed off. And that's the difference as we look back into the Cold War compared to the terrorism war, because the other side's not going to give up, and they're willing to commit suicide. They're willing to kill themselves, so many of these people. And that's why it's much more dangerous than the Cold War. So I just jokingly, have said to students, I actually wish for the days of the Cold War, because we know the result. Terrorism, we don't know what the long-range result's going to be. So, of course, kidding around, but just saying, that the Russians were tough, but they always backed off at the brink, ultimately, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the point is that we're going to start the evolution of, as I've said, of the Cold War. We're going to develop the concept of containment. That our goal is to contain the Soviet Union, and this is promoted by a State Department diplomat, George Kennan, the idea of containment. And, of course, Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of Britain, is going to come over, and he's going to talk about the Iron Curtain descending across Europe in a speech in Missouri in 1946. So these terms are part of the whole period: Cold War, containment, Iron Curtain. All right, and beginning in 47, we're going to have cooperation in Congress with the president, and this is interesting, because the midterm elections of 46, the first election since Truman became president, his ratings are very low, by the way, in polls. He's always low in ratings, constantly low in ratings. He has very low ratings. And part of it is the economy is going into a recession after the war as veterans return, and there's, at least for a while, trouble getting jobs. Inflation suddenly becomes a problem. And, of course, when you have inflation and unemployment, you make a lot of people unhappy. And, of course, it's as if the president's sitting there saying, I want to create inflation and unemployment. Of course not. But he gets blamed. That's just the way it is. He gets blamed. And the opposition Republicans, who have not been in control of both houses since 1930, are arguing, haven't you had enough? It's time to vote Republicans into both houses. All along it have been Democrats. And in 46, the Gallup polls and other polls say the Republicans are going to win big for both houses of Congress, a slap in the face to President Truman at the midterm. And they're absolutely right. The Republicans will win vast margins, and they will have the biggest margin of the 20th century, and they will never have it again as big a margin any time since. This is the biggest margin. They have tremendous margins. So they're in control, and the Speaker of the House now is Joseph Martin. And the Senate Majority Leader is Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, Mr. Conservative Republican, son of President William Howard Taft, with presidential ambitions. And the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee is conservative Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan. Vandenberg Air Force Base in California is named after him. Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan. And the Republican Party declares war on labor. And they're going to pass the Taft-Hartley Act against labor unions that have grown in the New Deal years. And it's going to come to Truman's desk. He's going to veto it. All right? Big moment. He's going to veto the Taft-Hartley Act. And the Congress, with Southern Democrats joining Republicans that have a wide margin, override the veto. And the Taft-Hartley Act becomes law. But by his doing what he's doing, Truman gains the labor vote in 48. And I look back and I say, the Republican Party lost the labor vote by the Taft-Hartley Act. What was in their mind that they thought that was a good thing to do? How were they going to benefit by that? They shot themselves in the foot. And they were going to lose in 48, the House and Senate, and what they thought they had guaranteed, the presidency. It was their fault. But he won the day. And this is after he had declared, quote, war against labor strikes in the coal industry, steel industry, railroad industry. At one point in 46, he said, if the strikers don't go back to work, I'm going to draft them into the military. Can you imagine that? I don't think he could have done that, but he antagonized labor. But then, when the Republican Party in 47 passed the Taft-Hartley Act, and he vetoed it and it passed over his veto, he became the hero of labor, and that was a big step forward that people didn't realize it was going to help Truman. All right, so as far as domestic events, the Republicans are at odds with Truman. He's going to veto a lot of bills. A lot of them are going to pass over his veto. Absolutely no cooperation. But in foreign affairs, the Republican Party in control will work with Truman, and they're going to pass into law the Truman Doctrine. This is a statement of Truman calling for aid to Greece and Turkey that are endangered by communist insurgency, and he asks for $400 million foreign aid. This is foreign aid beginning of foreign aid. Help Greece and Turkey. And the Republicans go along. Now, today, it's interesting. The Republican Party is very split on foreign aid. Some people say we still have to give aid to other countries. Others, like Rand Paul, want to wipe out all foreign aid. All right, that's going to be an issue in 2016. Do we wipe out foreign aid when it's only like 1% of the budget? but it's an issue. It's always been. But from the beginning, Taft is against foreign aid. He votes no. Vandenberg votes yes. So even among conservatives, then and now, we have a split on foreign aid. So even though Taft doesn't support it, the Truman Doctrine and the funding for Greece and Turkey work. And the following year, in 48, we have Secretary of State Marshall, former General Marshall, who promotes, with Truman's backing, the Marshall Plan. Rebuild Western Europe. Rebuild Britain, France, Italy, West Germany, and the smaller countries. And you might say, what do you mean rebuild? It's 3 years since the war. Western Europe lies in ruins. They can't rebuild. They're bankrupt. They can't do it themselves. We have to do it. And many people say, it's not our job to rebuild Europe or anywhere else. Truman and Marshall say it is. It will make these areas stay democratic, and it will prevent communism or any extreme fascism from expanding. They're right. And we have the Marshall Plan backed by most Republicans, not all, not Taft, but Vandenberg and others, and Democrats. And it's going to be a 3-year plan to rebuild Western Europe. We're going to spend $13 billion. Wow, that's a lot of money. But we rebuild Western Europe. We build good relations with these countries. They become good allies and friends. By 1949, we have NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, where we are there to defend them, and they will work to defend us if there's ever a war with the Soviet Union or its allies in Eastern Europe. The fact is we are very popular in Europe and Western Europe because of what we have done, and we have guaranteed the democratization of the western part of Europe will continue. All right, now, in the midst of all this, the Soviets under Joseph Stalin are creating problems, and they're going to blockade West Berlin. You got to remember, when the war ended, Berlin was split into 4 zones, and so was Germany, but all of Berlin was within the communist zone. So it meant we had a free sector, West Berlin, within communist East Germany, all the way up to 1989, and it was always an issue of access. And in 48, in June, we have Stalin deciding a blockade is beginning. Nothing can go into West Berlin by air. No troops, no supplies, nothing. And Truman has to deal with this issue. He makes it clear we're not going to allow this blockade. This is our territory, British, French, and American. We have a right to it. We are not going to allow this. So he says, we're going to do it anyway. If you're not going to let us go in by land or by sea, we're going to fly in. Oh, no, you're not, the Soviets say. We'll shoot down your planes if you're in East German airspace. And Truman says, go right ahead. Make my day. Even before Clint Eastwood said it. Not quite, but I'm making it up. All right, now, in any case, what happens is we fly planes, and the British and French, for 11 months, every day. Is this the day? Is there going to be a shooting down of a plane? And there could have been, of course, those who were shooting down planes who were not authorized. And we thought, oh, my God, because basically Truman said there could be World War III now. Doesn't happen. There's tension for 11 months. And interestingly, it's during the election of 48 this is happening. Now, I don't think anybody put it all together. You look back at it and you say, wow, look what Truman did. He vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act that passes over his veto, and he looks good for labor. That's very important domestically. He's tough with the Soviets right at the time of the election, not because he planned it. Stalin did it. You would almost think Stalin was his campaign manager, helping him be elected, being tough. Now, of course not, but he was tough, and I think that's another reason he got elected, because people said, this guy has guts, and he's doing what he needs to do, and if we have to go to war, we'll go to war. Luckily, we didn't have to. All right, but really amazing. In May 49, after 11 months of threats, the Soviets stopped the blockade without comment. We've won, but we had to go through hell, as we always did, but we won. They did not start a war, and they did not shoot down any planes. But that's what led to NATO being formed, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. All right, so Truman has a record. He has quite a record. He has a record of having accomplished, getting labor support. He is, of course, looking tough with the Soviets, although, again, maybe people didn't put it all together at the time. But still, the thought is, well, the Republicans have Congress, the 80th Congress, and it seems like there's no way that that the Democrats are going to gain it back, and Truman's not going to win. He's a loser. He just took over. His ratings are still low, and they are very low all along, never high. And by 47 to 48, the thought is Truman going to run for the full term or just finish up this term of 3 years and about 9 months, almost a term? Is he going to retire? And he thought of retiring, and we now know he approached former General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and asked him if he was willing to run as a Democrat for president. And Eisenhower, a non-political type, says, no, I'm not interested in being president. I don't have any interest in politics. He did ask him. In fact, at one point he said to Eisenhower, if you agree to run, I'll run as your vice president. Imagine that? That he would go back to being vice president? No, I'm not interested. This is interesting. He's wooing Eisenhower. It doesn't work. Later, Eisenhower runs as a Republican and attacks the Truman administration in running, obviously, against Adlai Stevenson. And the two men don't get along after that. They really don't. They don't like each other. Particularly, Truman doesn't like Eisenhower. When Truman doesn't like somebody, he lets you know. He has no problem. In fact, talking about Truman with Eisenhower, okay, he didn't like Eisenhower. The only time they made up, interestingly, they actually made up in 1963 at the funeral of JFK. When that was so, they were both there, old men, and Truman turned to Eisenhower and said, we're two old men. What are we doing here at the funeral of a young man who's president? And they shook hands, and they got over it for the last few years. It's amazing how people make issues and let it affect them. It's so silly. All right, now, but the thing is, another example, another president that he really condemned when he was a congressman, Richard Nixon, as a congressman, going after Truman, calling him soft on communism, pursuing the Al-Jahis case in 1948. And Truman didn't know Nixon personally. He knew he was this new, young California congressman. But he was asked once, what do you think about this Congressman Nixon? And I'm not going to say the whole word. I'm just going to use the letters. He said, oh, he's an SOB. He actually said that. He said that about Nixon. He was right, actually. We now know. But he actually said it at the time. Now, not only did he say it, they were bad-mouthing each other. And when Nixon was vice president, Truman was critical of him. And when he was running for president, he was critical of him and all that. And then Nixon's president. And Truman's an old man. Now the thought is, what do they have in common, these two men? Well, they're both president, right, once Nixon gets in, and they both played the piano, all right? Truman did, and his piano's still in the White House. Nixon, becoming president, decides he's going to be statesmanlike. He's going to decide to bring the Truman piano to the Truman Library, where it is, and I've been to the Truman Library. So he decides, we're not going to leave it in the White House. This is Truman's piano. We're going to ship it to the Truman Library, and he's going to go there to give it to him, in a ceremony, and the two men are going to stand next to each other, and he's going to make a statement about, I'm very proud to give you, Mr. President, the piano, blah, 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 that kind of thing. Now, I am sure Truman was not looking forward to this meeting. He certainly was nice to get it was nice to get the piano, but to have to deal with this man he had called an SOB and despised. So I remember watching it at the time. It was funny as hell. It really was funny. Nixon's beaming and all that, and he's making his little statement. And Truman's sitting next to him. Now he's 85 years old. He looks as if he needs to make a bowel movement, honestly. That's the kind of look on his face. Either that or he's got a stomach ache, He looks like, ooh. And, but he's standing there, but he's not smiling or happy that, oh, you're being nice to me. And then Nixon turns to Truman and says, Mr. President, why don't we sit down at the piano together and do a song together? And, Truman turned and glared at him, and they agreed to do it. But he wasn't a happy camper. He did not want to have to do this. But, of course, Nixon was being nice. But it was funny. It just was funny. I mean, here's a guy who defends his daughter against a Washington Post critic. He tells us what he thinks about Nixon. He fights with Eisenhower. The man is who he is. He's genuine. Not every president or every politician is genuine. Genuineness is a plus. It really is, even if you don't always agree. He's genuine. He's what he is. And even when he was out of office already, he used to go to New York to see his daughter Margaret, who had married Clifton Daniel of the New York Times. And, of course, they had sons and all that. And he used to take a walk every morning outside where he was staying. And here he was in his, late 70s and early 80s, and all these young reporters were there to talk to him, and he would always say something interesting. But he'd walk along very briskly, and the young reporters they couldn't keep up with him. The guy was amazing. And I remember watching and saying, oh, my God, you're just amazing. An unbelievable guy. Very admirable guy. You don't have to always agree with him, but, boy, you got to admire the guy. Again, gutsy, courageous, decisive, and genuine. And, my gosh, if you're that, what else matters? You don't have to always be right. Nobody's always right, but you got to say this is something. All right, now, the point is that the thought is, though, he can't win. So he thinks of Eisenhower. Then there is talk of Justice Douglas again running. Again, we know about the Douglas problem. If he had run, he couldn't have been married 4 times, I don't think. I mean, it'd be hard to imagine. And there were some others that are thinking of it. But ultimately, Truman decides to run, and his convention nominates him with the thought, oh, this is like a funeral. He's going to lose, but we have no choice. And then the thing is, after the convention, 2 Democrats break away. They don't try to challenge him for the Democratic nomination. They break away. One is the former Vice President, Henry Wallace, who is very angry at Truman. Of course, he's also ambitious himself. He could have been president if only things had been different. But what is he challenging him on? The Cold War. He doesn't like the foreign policy of Truman. He doesn't have a problem with him domestically, but he doesn't like the foreign policy. So he forms a movement that has a name that is sadly not the same as it was, the Progressive Party of 1948. Now, I look back at the Progressive Party of 1912, Teddy Roosevelt. I would have voted for him. I would have in 1912. The Progressive Party of 1924, Robert La Follette Sr., senator from Wisconsin, Mr. Progressive. I would have voted for him in 1924. But and I was born already, but if I had been there in 48, I would not have voted for Henry Wallace. The Progressive Party of 48, sadly, used the name Progressive, but it was not anything like the La Follette or Teddy Roosevelt parties. And unfortunately, who, among others, backed it? The Communist Party of the United States, which did not run a candidate, not that they were going to win, and he didn't get the point that a lot of his supporters were really people who were not necessarily thinking of what was good for America. And we have to wonder, had he been elected, and we have debate about this. I've done lectures with some people defend Wallace, and I'm sure some of you might defend Wallace. But to me, Wallace was a visionary that was living in a dream world when he looked at the Soviet Union, and I just can't imagine Wallace, assuming he had been as president like he was as a candidate, that it would have been a disaster. But maybe it would have been different if he had been president first. Who knows? All I know is by 48, he just looked, I think, a little ridiculous, and he was going to do very poorly, only get about 1 million votes, no states, no electoral votes, a real bomb, really. Nobody knew that, of course, so was concerned that the far left might vote for him. And then a much more serious threat, Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, the governor then, Democrat, later senator, then a Republican, marrying the young woman much later and all that. But Strom Thurmond, a segregationist, and why is he running for governor of South Carolina on the States' Rights Party, known as the Dixiecrats informally? Because Truman had done what's hard to believe. In the spring of 48, he had integrated the military by executive order, wow, and also integrated Washington, D.C. by executive order. This is a guy that we had no idea he would do this. This is what Wallace would have done, because he was already talking about things like that. So imagine those Southerners who thought, oh, Truman's safe, Wallace is out, and then suddenly discover Truman is doing what Wallace would have done on civil rights. All right, now, of course you might say, well, we know why he did it. He wants more African-American votes in the North. Yeah, maybe, but honestly, blacks were not voting Republican by then. They weren't. So the ones who were voting, more of them might have voted, but the South he was endangering, that he could win it. The South was always Democratic. Was he going to win the South? He was not going to win 4 states because of this. This was gutsy. But what he had done was integrate the military, and many of the bases were in the South, and people said, you can't do this. You can't expect us to sleep next to Negroes or shower next to Negroes. And the answer is, yes, I can. And if you don't want to do it, retire, resign, leave. But that's the way it's going to be. And as far as Washington, D.C., changing the executive order of Woodrow Wilson in 1913 that led to segregation in public places and had not been reversed even by FDR. Okay, so, this is a man of guts and courage. But that is what made Thurman run, and he ran. And, of course, we didn't know at the time that he had a 25-year-old mixed-race daughter through a liaison. We only found it out when he died at 100 years of age. And only in 2003 we learned about it. Unbelievable. What a hypocrite. Well, what's new about that? But the point is, he ran on the idea that if he was elected, he would go back on what he had done. He would reverse those civil rights orders, the executive orders, which is certainly not the kind of thing you would expect from a president. You don't repeal things that are already established. That does not make you look good in history. And I don't think it would have happened. Anyway, he wasn't going to win, but he ran. So we have 2 Democrats running on the left and the right. Truman looks weak. The polls are weak. And the Republicans, they have a few people who want to run. Among them are General Douglas MacArthur, but he does not do well in primaries, unfortunately for him. We also have Arthur Vandenberg would like to run, and Robert Taft would like to run, and also Harold Stassen, who is seen as a serious candidate, but ends up running more times for president than anybody. He keeps on running for the next 40 years and never gets very far, but he becomes a joke. In the beginning, he was serious. He was the boy governor of Minnesota at age 31. He was a serious candidate in 48, but he's not going to stop Governor Thomas E. Dewey, who would run against Roosevelt, lost, but was well known already. Dewey is the nominee of the party. He is from Michigan, but becomes governor of New York, just as Mitt Romney is from Michigan, but becomes governor of Massachusetts. And one thing in common with both of them, they're both stiff as hell as candidates. They just are. Romney's a stiff candidate, not a relaxed guy. Neither is Dewey. They're both stiff candidates. They don't come across as warm and friendly and fuzzy. They just don't. Not everybody does, but it helps if you do. And Romney did not in 2012, and neither did Dewey in 44, 48. But everybody in 48 said, Dewey's got it. Every poll showed him ahead. I mean, there isn't one that says otherwise. And it looks like the election's over, especially with the three-way split in the Democratic Party. How could it possibly work out? But Truman decides, well, I may not win, but I'm going to fight. I'm not going to give up. He's going to go on a whistle-stop campaign by train across the country, whistle-stop tour. And everywhere he goes, the media follow him, and they notice the crowd's getting larger. And the thought is, why are the crowds getting larger? Doesn't quite, well, the thought is, face the fact he's the president of the United States. So even if you don't like him, if you can be near a president, it's sort of like exciting. I always have said I would love to be near any president and maybe get to say hello or shake his hand. I don't care who it is. You know, even if I don't like the guy, I wouldn't vote for him. So that's part of it. But then the thought is maybe his message of attacking the 80th Congress, the Republican 80th Congress, calling them the Do-Nothing Congress, which is what he called them. Now, this is interesting because I just heard this morning. The Do-Nothing Congress, which he condemned, certainly was seen as very much against him. But how many laws did they pass? 1,700. How many did the Congress we've now seen? Well, it's not over yet next year. How many laws has Congress passed this year? Less than 100. This is the Do-Nothing Congress, as well as the one of 11 and 12. These are the real, it's getting fewer and fewer laws. Now, some people say you don't have to pass a lot of laws. I agree, but just look at the difference of how laws have gone down in numbers dramatically from what they used to be. Again, nobody's saying you got to have a certain number, but if you have too few, it makes you wonder, is Congress doing its job? Is it working? That's the issue. Anyway, he attacks the Do-Nothing 80th Congress, particularly on domestic affairs, and of course the Berlin blockade and airlift is helping him, you know, because of the time factor. And of course, there are no debates yet or anything like that. The question comes up, is he really doing well? Well, the polls show a little closing, but not much. Still way behind. And election night comes, and Bess Truman is packing to leave for 2 months away, and she's so thrilled because she doesn't want to come back. Everybody around the president's gloomy. Oh, he's not going to win. Only Truman thinks he's going to win. At midnight, it's clear. In the Northeast, Dewey from New York is winning. And Northeast, you know, that's then when it's Republican. Now it's Democratic, the Northeast, but it was. So he's ahead in electoral votes. So the Chicago Tribune, a conservative paper, decides it's over, although the votes are not all counted yet, takes time. And they put out a midnight headline, Dewey defeats Truman. All right? Put it out on the stands and send it to the people who get it at home. And overnight, you go to bed thinking, oh, yeah, Dewey won. You know, whatever you felt, good or bad. You wake up, and what had happened? Truman had staged the upset victory of all time. He had won Ohio, Illinois, California. Didn't win the Northeast, no, but he won big states. Ohio is crucial always, Illinois and California. He had won 303 electoral votes. Thurman had won 39, 4 states. Dewey had won 189. What an upset victory. And that afternoon, the famous photograph of Truman holding up the Chicago Tribune headline and beaming, the headline that says Dewey defeats Truman. And if you have an original of the Chicago Tribune with that headline, you could sell it on eBay for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars. I've looked it up. There are some online. You know, now I got to say, in 2000, I have original papers of the Miami Herald that say Gore defeats Bush. It's not going to be worth as much, but there were papers that did say it because at one point he did. At one point he was ahead, according to the official count. I'm not going to go into that election who really won, of course. That's something else. But I'm saying it did say what did not end up happening, but it's not quite the same as Truman. I mean, that's a little more shocking. All right, so he's in for a second term. Unfortunately, second terms are not very good in general. It just seems that way. We have China going communist. Couldn't do much about it. Chiang Kai-shek flees to Taiwan. The Korean War comes suddenly. North Korea invades South Korea, and we have an intervention there, and we lose 33,000 men in 3 years, plus hundreds of thousands wounded. And of course, only Eisenhower finally, by threats of nuclear weapons, gets a truce and an end of the fighting. In 1953, this becomes a negative thing for, of course, Truman. Even though it's only 3 years, it's not like Afghanistan or Iraq, but still, it's very disturbing. And of course, there's the big debate about what should we do? Should we invade North Korea or China? And Douglas MacArthur wants to do that. He's the head of the UN forces in Korea. And Truman does not want to do that. Not just Truman, but the other people around him. And MacArthur meets with Truman and does not show respect for him. He's the commander-in-chief, after all, and keeps on talking publicly, embarrassing the president about strategy. So in April 1951, Truman fires Douglas MacArthur, who's already about 75 anyway. He was certainly going to be retiring soon. He comes home, and the Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats talk of impeaching Truman. Impeaching him? The president has the authority to fire generals. He is in charge. It brings us back memories of General George McClellan and Lincoln in the Civil War. I mean, this is the way it is. You don't have to agree with the president, but he makes foreign policy and military policy, not a general. But I mean, this certainly is a moment of guts and courage by Truman. Most people would say it was the right thing to do. Of course, I was talking to someone before the class today about the fact, looking at what's going on in North Korea now, you might think, oh gosh, maybe we should have invaded North Korea. But Truman's viewpoint was, you invade North Korea and go into China, and it's a land war you can't win because there's too many Chinese, you'll never win. And honestly, you cannot have a conventional war in Asia. You just can't. I don't see how you can, then or now. And I don't think the American people were ready for that. All right, but the Korean War is a downer, of course. We had, of course, recognized Israel, as I've said. That was in 48. Now, meanwhile, Truman does promote the fair deal, his idea of expansion of the New Deal. He wants to get rid of the Taft-Hartley Act. He's not able to do that. He wants to have civil rights laws. Can't get it done. Wants to have the beginning of a national health care plan. He actually promotes it. It takes 60 years or more to get to this, to get to where we are now. He wants federal aid to education, saying we have to have a national standard. We won't have it until Sputnik, and Eisenhower pushing it. So he is a visionary for the future, but he's not in domestic affairs going to be able to accomplish his fair deal ideas. It just doesn't happen because of the way the Congress is set up and the way things are, and he's a lame duck president. And then he could have run again. The 22nd Amendment did not affect him. He had come in after it was before it was ratified. He could have had another term, and the joke was if he had decided to run for another term, Bess would have divorced him. I think she would have. She would not have tolerated another term, and he is 68 years old, so he goes home without a pension. It's during his time that a pension system is set up after he's out of office, but he goes home pretty damn poor, and then, of course, we'll have some pension after given by Congress. And the Truman Library will be built, and it's well worth a visit, and his home right there. I spent the whole day at the library and the museum. It's just amazing, and it just was a fantastic time when I did that in 2012. It was one of the best trips I've ever done, all right? And Truman would live on and visit his daughter and live on almost 20 years, and finally, unfortunately, die at age 88 and a half on December 26th, 1972. Now, all his life, even when he was out of office, he was paying. Wasn't very good. Everybody was critical of him. When he died, things changed. I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. This is what keeps Jimmy Carter hopeful. It's what keeps George W. Bush hopeful. He's even said it. It's what keeps, I guess, George H.W. Bush hopeful. All right, Bill Clinton doesn't have to worry. Everybody loves him, right? At least more so. But a lot of presidents are not well appreciated. Now, what I'm saying is, I'm not saying Carter or either Bush is going to be Truman's level. But you could be sure, within a decade after they die, they will look better in history than they do now. There's something about dying that helps. It just does. It just does. And you start to look at things differently because the passions are gone, because they're dead. This is one of the problems that Herbert Hoover had. He lived too long after, just like Carter. You die sooner, your ratings go up. You live on, and ratings go down or stay down. I mean, it's just the way it is. All right, now, the point is that Truman, 5 years after he dies, by 77, Time magazine is calling it Truman Mania. And we are having Truman Mania. Suddenly, people are discovering, my God, this guy was gutsy, courageous, decisive, and, he's a man of principle and genuine. And okay, there's criticisms that can be made, and it continues. But boy, did he shoot up. Did he shoot up. And in the C-SPAN poll of scholars, he is, in 2009, he's rated number 5. And I'm sure that if there's an afterlife, he's smiling up there and saying, and of course he's up there, not down there. I'm sure he's up there, that he's smiling and saying, wow, I did all right, didn't I? I filled the shoes of FDR. Yes, you did. Now, I would put him 4th. The top 3 is pretty settled. Number 1 is Lincoln. 2 and 3 you could debate. Officially, it's Washington 2nd and FDR 3rd. I would switch it, FDR, Washington. 4th, and I do think he's important, and we'll talk about him another time in the future, I'm sure, Teddy Roosevelt. But as exciting as he is, he doesn't have the crisis atmosphere that Lincoln has, Washington has, FDR has, and Truman has. And think about the others. They all got elected. They knew they were going to face crisis and had a few, certainly with FDR and Lincoln, had time to think about it for 4 months. Truman didn't have any time. He suddenly became president. He was thrust into it, and he had to figure out what to do. So, I mean, in a way, maybe even deserves to be a little higher, but I guess he can't be. But being 4th or 5th, wow, Harry, you did a good job, and we all applaud you, and we thank you for having been our 33rd president, and we honor you, and we appreciate you now. And this audience certainly has a lot of Truman lovers, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And I just say, Harry, you did a good job, and I think we all can just say, thank goodness that you existed and you were there when we needed you. All right, and that's what I have to say. Thank you. And we have time for questions or comments or jokes, whatever you want. We have time, and I hope that there are questions and comments that can be made. So, yes, and I will repeat your question. True, Merle Miller's book, it was not mentioned, Plain Speaking. There's a whole list I could have done, but I figured if I gave you too long a list, it would make everybody's eyes glaze over. And that's why I picked what I consider the most important. But, of course, Merle Miller's Plain Speaking is very important. But out of that list, I would say McCullough's book is the most important. And I would say Dalek's book is second most important. And, of course, Margaret Truman talking about her own father obviously is important. Very definitely, So, but I mean, I'm not trying to say they're the only good books, but again, it's a short list. But the list on Truman has developed a lot since 1972, because honestly, before that, he was pretty much ignored, just like Carter has been pretty much ignored, and even Bush 1 has been ignored, because they're living on a long time. I mean, Bush 1 is 20 years now out of office in January, and Carter 33. He's broken the record of Hoover, and his vice president is still alive too, Walter Mondale, longest surviving team ever, a third of a century on January 20th coming up. So, I mean, once they're gone, it'll be more research available, and just things will change, and for Bush 1 and Carter, and also eventually for the second Bush, and really for all of them. Like Ford, it's only been a few years, but Ford, there started to be stuff on Ford coming out, and already we look at Ford as someone to admire. I never cared for him that much at the time, but I've really come to look at him differently, and I've been to the Ford Museum in Grand Rapids, and I really, somehow, as you have time for perspective, you look at things differently than when you're living through it. So that's why the virtue of people dying is that it helps to give us a chance to think about, rather than think about, oh, he's speaking up again, or he's saying something stupid, or, they all do. If you live long enough, we all say something stupid. So I would say, like with Carter, a lot of things I admire, but sometimes I would say, don't talk. Shut up already. You're making more enemies as you speak. So it's just the way it is. But once he's gone, or any of these others, then things are looked at differently. Yes? Well, I did mention Alger Hiss, yeah, but I did not specifically mention McCarthyism. Yes, of course, he condemned Joseph McCarthy, and he condemned Nixon, who was really the first Joseph McCarthy. And of course, well, he was. He was Joseph McCarthy before Joseph McCarthy, but then he was. And then he realized maybe don't be in the forefront because that might make you not able to advance, because he ended up advancing by being in the background, not as much being up front. No, of course, I didn't mean to leave it out in the sense, but the point is that he was bitterly condemned for McCarthy. He condemned McCarthy. He was accused himself, Truman, of being soft on communism. And the thing is, he did defend Truman al-Jahis, and there's still a debate about al-Jahis, whether he really was a spy or not. Seems like he was, it seems. And of course, the Rosenberg case came up at that time, but that had nothing to do directly with Truman. But I mean, Truman was under constant attack, and he certainly gave as good as he got in the sense of condemnation, but he was the Democratic president with a Republican senator named MacArthur, who was claiming that the government was soft on communism, even though they were fighting the Cold War. But of course, firing MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, sort of made him seem soft to some people, but he was doing what he thought made sense foreign policy-wise, that we could not commit to a land war in Asia. And I don't think we could have at the time, really. Financially, emotionally, culturally, it's very hard. It's easy to look back and say, well, maybe we should have, because of North Korea, because North Korea is a headache. But, it's not realistic, I don't think. Yes?
I remember back about 1951, 52, Truman returning to Washington.
Probably to Wake Island when he met MacArthur. Yeah.
Anyway, the news people are at the train station or something. Did you hear about what Senator McCarthy said about it? He said, no, but if McCarthy says it, it's a lie.
Well, I think anything McCarthy said was a lie. It's been shown. Although you get people who defend him to the end of their lives. National Review, in the 50th anniversary of his death, said he was the greatest man of the century. I mean, it depends on how you want to look at it, So, but I think Truman, if he thought you were a liar, he'd come out. And if he thought Nixon was an SOB, he'd say the words, and he would. But it's not maybe diplomatic, not tactful to use that kind of language, but.
One more thing. Truman did, I think, sign an executive order putting a new internal security.
Yes, on the issue of Truman and security, we did have the loyalty oaths, which is controversial, that people in the government should not be checked out, and some people would quit, but most were shown to be fine. That is the beginning of intrusive government, which continues today, and it is something that's much criticized. But I guess what one would say is politically, if he had done nothing on that, he would have, in fact, somehow, no matter what he did, he was attacked anyway, but he would have been seen as even softer and not aware of the communist threat, in quotes, if he had not done the executive orders. So every president, no matter whether it's Democrat, Republican, conservative, or liberal, they're always going to do things that we don't understand because we're not in that job. And I'm not defending any president, but again, you have all the facts. You and I do not. You meaning the president. And you can't just do what's popular. You have to do what's seen, like Lincoln during the Civil War, of course, curbed civil liberties in ways that were upsetting. But we tend to look back and say, unavoidable. Now, I don't know if it's unavoidable with Truman or unavoidable now with Obama or Bush, that kind of thing. But again, we do not understand everything. I mean, I want to point out that just as an example, and this is true of every president, when Obama won the election and he was going to the CIA headquarters or the NSA headquarters after the election to find out what's really going on because he had won, he went in smiling. He came out frowning because he said, oh my God, what did I get myself into? Because there's nothing like being in that job, and we cannot fully understand that because we're not there. And I'm glad we're not. There were some communists, a small number in the government, yes. All right, yes?
Yeah, I'd just like to point out how the course of history might have been different. Truman resisted pressure from Churchill that wanted to go in and take over the British petroleum in Iran. And Truman resisted all efforts to undermine President Mossadegh in Iran.
Mm-hmm.
The minute Eisenhower came in with the Dulles brothers,
That's true.
And the course of history would have been different if Iran was democratic.
You mean if there was no Shah, you mean? Yeah.
If we had not put the Shah in.
Yeah. Well, we made a lot of mistakes in foreign policy. The Cold War made us, you could say, do all kinds of things that, looking back, were probably big mistakes, yes. But of course, we're all geniuses when we look back. You can't know all the facts. But
Rusty came to the States and trusted, and it was a tremendous recognition that he could have been the George Washington of Iran. And a lot of people were very, very upset.
Well, but he felt that it was not our business to intervene in that kind of a way. But Eisenhower definitely, with the Dulles brothers, and that's one thing that doesn't make him look good, by the way. He looks better in history in many ways, Eisenhower. But if you start to investigate more, he's the one that talks about the military-industrial complex, and yet he actually promoted it. And yet he's condemning it when he leaves office. So it's like, huh? So there's contradictions. But actually, that's what's going to happen when this president leaves. He's going to condemn certain things that he's done. And, in some way he'll twist it around. They all do. I mean, I'm cynical enough to say no matter who's in the office, they're all going to twist things to try to make themselves look good. And the farewell address is certainly a place to do it. But if you really are an historian and you look, and over time you get the actual documents, then you realize, some of it's hypocrisy. And it's not just, Eisenhower or this or that guy. It's just the way it is. Well, thank you. Thank you. Okay, who else? Yes.
Truman wrote an open letter criticizing JFK.
Yes, he was not. Truman was not for John F. Kennedy. He was for Stuart Symington.
Was it the father or?
Well, partially the father, and he also thought Kennedy. I think he even maybe not in the letter, but I think he basically said he needs to shave first, as if he had not grown up. And he was 43, but he looked young. But he was for Stuart Symington, senator from his own state of Missouri. And actually, I was into politics at that age. I was a mid-teenager. And I'm not saying I preferred Symington, but I liked Symington. I thought Symington would have been decent. And he was on the short list to be Kennedy's vice president. And in fact, would have been the choice, we have learned, except that people around Kennedy said, you got to ask LBJ first, and he'll say no, then you can pick Symington. We could have had President Symington if Johnson had said no. And Symington would have been good. I think he would have been good. Now, my own favorite in '60 was Humphrey. I was a big Humphrey fan. I always loved Humphrey. But Symington I liked. I actually thought Kennedy was not as good as the others. He was all right, but he was not my choice. I didn't like Johnson, but I thought Humphrey first, Symington second. And Symington could have been vice president if LBJ had decided not to accept the offer. So Truman really wanted Symington, and it was a good choice because Symington was very solid, centrist Democrat, good on defense, a good man, served in the Senate for quite a bit longer. So, but yeah, he was not a big fan of Kennedy because of the father, and also he thought he was too inexperienced and young. And honestly, out of the Senate candidates in '60, he was the least qualified. I could also argue Obama was far less qualified than many of his opponents in '08 in the primaries. It doesn't matter. You don't get picked by being the best qualified. It doesn't work that way because I think Hillary was better qualified, Joe Biden was better qualified, I think Bill Richardson was better. A lot of people were better qualified on paper, but it doesn't work that way that the best qualified wins. If they did, we'd have very different presidents than we've had. So it's just the way it is. Yes, who else? In the back, yes. Yes. About 2 weeks, yeah. About 2 weeks before the election, the polling stopped. No, it was a mistake to stop the polling, but also polling was not sophisticated as it would become later. And, but they really messed it up, yes. And they really stopped too soon. In a way, the pollsters were being a little cocky and arrogant that it was over before it was over. And we now realize last-minute changes can occur. And it certainly did in 1948, absolutely. Yes, now the person in front of him had your hand raised, I think, didn't you? No? Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, I was mentioned about Truman and the second bomb, yes. Well, I thought I said that if I had been, as if I was going to be, I would have waited a few more days. I wouldn't say I wouldn't have used it, but 3 days was awfully short timing. It was like a 1-2 punch, that's what people say, but I probably would have waited a few more days. Now, maybe not long enough, because I don't know if I would have waited to the 14th when they finally said, we're going to surrender. And who says they would have if there hadn't been a second bomb? So, but I think I would have delayed it a little bit. I don't think it would have been a big problem to delay it. I wouldn't say I wouldn't have used it, but I would have delayed it and maybe not used it, is my thought, basically. Yes, thank you. Well, his mother-in-law was, but from what I've understood, Bess also was. That she wasn't a big look. At that time, there was plenty of anti-Semitism still, as there had been in the Great Depression, World War II. Even for Jews in the military, it wasn't easy. So, definitely the mother-in-law was a problem. But from what I've gathered, so was Bess. Maybe not said out loud, but But it is interesting because I wonder if he's one thing I say. He's a man of guts and courage and principle. What if he had walked in with Eddie Jacobson? What would have happened if he had just brought him in and said, "Hi, here's Eddie"? What would have happened? I would have loved to be the fly on the wall to see what would have happened. What would Mrs. Wallace, the mother-in-law, have said? Just would love to. I mean, there's a virtue in being a fly on the wall. The only problem is you get killed eventually. That's the only with the swatter. Yeah, yes. Yeah, well, I didn't specifically mention Potsdam. They questioned Truman at Potsdam. Truman at Potsdam, yes, he met him. The only time he met Stalin, and Stalin was charming, as you say. He knew how to be charming, as all these dictators do. But the point is that Truman soon came to be aware, or was already aware, that Stalin could not be trusted, and that's why we had the evolution of containment going on. It took a while. It didn't happen overnight, but we did have the evolution of containment, absolutely, yes. That was the only time he met him. There would not be another summit until Eisenhower met the Soviet leader Bulganin in 1955, 10 years later. So it was a long time without a meeting. Yes?
Last night I read in the book that Truman is one of those that gave Hoover attempted to blackmail by speaking with him after he became president, showing him the records he was in discussions.
That Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, had a record of indiscretions by Truman? I'm not aware of any indiscretions. I think Hoover could have made them up. He was a wacko. I'm talking about J. Edgar. And by the way, I've had people say to me, is he the one that wore a dress? I said, no. Excuse me, Herbert Hoover. I'm talking about Herbert. I said, do not connect Herbert Hoover to J. Edgar Hoover. Herbert Hoover is enough to deal with the Depression. Don't add on J. Edgar Hoover and his problems to Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is the better one. He was actually decent, just had bad luck. No, but I'm not aware. I mean, honestly, I'm not aware of anything. But he could have manufactured things, and the FBI certainly, it's not always to be trusted. Historically, we've had it investigated at times. They have a lot of power, and these agencies are dangerous, just like the NSA and the CIA. They're necessary, but they're dangerous, and probably I'm being recorded now, and a file is developing on me, because I'm saying this. I'm sorry, but I'm going to say it anyway. All right? Who else? Any other? Yes? Oh, yes. Yes, that's a very good question. Herbert Hoover and Truman. Truman and Herbert Hoover became fast friends when Truman was president. He had him head the Hoover Commission to reorganize the government agencies after World War II. That's true. FDR and Hoover had nothing in common. They were angry at each other at the time of the inauguration. FDR never invited Hoover. But indeed, Truman did make friends with Hoover, did utilize his services, and the two men came to respect each other greatly. And of course, Hoover was also at the funeral of President Kennedy with Eisenhower and Truman. And again, seeing these three old men and then looking at the young president that had just been killed, it was heartbreaking. It still is. So, and we'll have a chance to talk about JFK next time, of course, which I'll be doing on April 1st. But anyway, any other, and by the way, it's April Fool's Day, but it's not a joke. I just wanted to let you know. It's real. It's April 1st, 12 noon. Any other questions or comments? Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.